My mom has been asking about Quilt as you go, and this is a technique that I only really use for small projects, but I thought if she's asking about it and thinking about it, maybe some of you out there are, so this would make a great video topic. Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and we're going to go down the rabbit hole of Quilt as you go today. I want to tell you what it is, I want to teach you how you can use it on some smaller projects, and then I want to try a couple of tests. I want to see if I can use it to make something a little bit more intricate than what I've done in the past, and maybe even take it to the next level and make a full Quilt as you go quilt. So what is Quilt as you go? Quilt as you go is just a technique that quilters use to piece and quilt their project at the same time. I have an example for you. This is a quilted postcard that I made with some leftover Tula Pink fabric. And all I did is, as I was building this out, I made sure that my batting was laid behind the fabric as I was piecing it. Now, because it's a quilted postcard, there is no fabric on the back. It's just a piece of cardstock. If you want to see a tutorial for how I put this together, I will link a live stream where I did these in the description box down below. You can still use this technique and just put fabric on the back, and then you'll be able to make a mug rug or some other smaller project like a wall hanging or a mouse pad. So obviously, this is a really simple design element. I've just got some straight pieces of fabric that are kind of wrapping around that center element. And that's how I have traditionally used Quilt as you go. Things like a log cabin block or a courthouse step or even just a strip block, a strip foundation block. Those are all great ways that I have done Quilt as you go in the past. But I want to challenge myself and I want to take it to the next level. So let's first try to make a quilted postcard and introduce some intricate shapes. I am sitting here with a piece of batting and some scraps and a headache because I couldn't figure out how I would tackle making a star using Quilt as you go. In my head, I felt like every single time I took a seam, it had to go through my foundation. And when I say foundation, that means my batting and or backing. Remember, I don't have backing because I'm making a Quilt as you go postcard. And then it occurred to me, why do I have to take all of my seams on the foundation? Take a look at this postcard that I made before. What if I gave myself the freedom to only go through the foundation layer when I was adding elements to the block? Right? Did your mind just explode the way mine did? Yeah. What if I gave myself the freedom to build out elements like flying geese and half square triangle units just piecing like I normally would? But then when I was ready to add those elements to the block, I went through the foundation. When I embraced that idea, yeah, the whole world opened up. And now I've got all these different ideas that I feel like I could use to make a quilted postcard that doesn't look like this. So let me show you what I'm going to do to make that block. All right, so the first thing that I need to be aware of is how big of a canvas am I working with? This is my batting. It is 5 inches by 7 inches. And I know I want to make my star in the middle so that it's taking up about 4.5 inches of room. That way I have a 1/4 inch on either side for my zigzag. My center square on this, I just want it to be 2 inches finished. So I'm going to start by grabbing a piece of fabric and I'm going to cut that at 2.5 inches. Now this is going to be the center foundation that I build against. So this, I'm going to place it onto my batting in the position that I want it to stay. So I'm just going to set that there. Next, I need to build out some flying geese units or half square triangle units or whatever I'm going to use for the star blocks. I know I want this background, the black background, and I want the star legs to kind of be this really pretty corally color. So I'm going to make some flying geese units that will fill up this area, and this area, these 4 areas, with the black as the triangle point pointing in towards the middle, and this being the star legs. I'm going to cut a piece at 1 3/4, and now it is 2.5 inches wide, so I'm going to cut it at 2.5 inches this way. So I'm cutting my background at 1.5 inches by 1 3/4 by 2.5 inches. Sorry, 1 3/4 by 2.5 inches. And now I'm just going to cut a couple of squares at 1 3/4 because I want it to be the height of this. So 2 1 3/4 inch squares of this coral. Here's one. Here's another. Now I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to do what I normally would to build out a flying geese unit. I'm going to stitch from one corner down to the other and we'll see how this works out. Once I have this unit made, I'm just going to line it up with the raw edge of the square that was already laid against the foundation. And I'm just going to kind of test flipping that over with 1/4 inch or so and make sure that it looks the way I want it to look. Now you'll notice that my point is not touching the center square. That's okay. For me, I was all right with it being wonky and not having a point come perfectly in. It has to do with how I measured this. Remember, I pulled 2.5 inches by 1 3/4 inch, which up here ahead of this point gives me more than 1/4 inch. If I want this to be perfectly cleaned up, then what I could do is come in and square this up just 1/4 inch away from this point, and then I could line it up so that the point is right up here. But I'm okay with it looking like this. So I'm going to line those pieces of fabric up, and I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch away right from here through the batting and both pieces of that fabric. This is going to quilt it as I'm piecing it. So I am right now following the quilt as you go technique. I'm just going to start right on the edge of that fabric and I'm going to end right on the edge of this fabric. Then when I come back over here, I'm just going to flip this up and make sure I'm happy with the placement of where that's at. It's extending past here, which means when I'm all done, I am going to chop off that point. But again, this is just a trial to see if I can do it. So I'm okay with that too. So we're going to repeat this one more time to do a star leg on this side. Remember, this is 1 3/4 by 2.5. And we're going to do 2 more over here. So a total of 3 more of those star legs. Once I have my star block made for the other side, I'm just going to line it up. Stitch it on the opposite side of the one that I did before. Now that I've got these 2 star legs on, this was actually really easy because I just stitched on either side of this. But now I've got to put my star legs on over here, and you'll notice I've got empty space here. This is where my mind starts to unravel a little bit when it comes to Quilt As You Go. But remember, I gave myself the freedom to add fabric to the pieces before I added those pieces to the block. So rather than putting these on now, I would do just like if I were building out the rows of this star block. I'm going to add some black here and here to this unit. I'm going to add some black to either side of this unit, and I'm just going to make sure that I've got enough black that it's going to extend off of the batting because I'm going to square it all up when it's done anyway. So I'm just going to cut off a chunk of black that I know will work, and I'm going to go piece this. Now, if you wanted to be super careful with your fabric and not waste anything, you could, of course, measure all of this out. Just make sure to always work into it your seam allowance. These are scraps. They are already leftover pieces from another project, so I'm not really terribly worried about wasting. So I stitched black onto this side and I just finger pressed it out. Look, I've got this whole area up here that's not even. I'm not going to worry about that because I'm going to take care of that in the next step. I'm going to take another piece of this scrap black and I'm going to line it up on this side and I'm just going to stitch. And once that's done, kind of have a row that looks a little uneven. I can take this over to my ruler and line it up with the edge of the top of that unit and clean this up. I don't have to if I don't want to, because I can clean it up with a pair of scissors when I do Quilt As You Go, but this might make more sense to your brain. Then my next step is going to be to line up this star leg so it's on top of that center square, as close as I can get it. And now I'm just going to stitch through the batting and all of my fabric all the way down this row. Once that side is on, we'll press it over. I'm starting to get a star block here, so this works out really well. We're going to do that again with 2 more scrap pieces. I just need to make sure that the scrap piece is going to cover this area plus seam allowances, and I should be okay. Press that with my fingers out and away. I'm not going to trim this off so you can see a demonstration of what I would have done had I not cleaned that up. I am going to line this up on top of my block, and I'm going to stitch along this edge just like I did before. Once that side's added on, we'll just press this out with my fingers. And on this side, you can see I've kind of got these weird pieces kind of hanging out. I don't even have to worry about that right now. Here's the beauty of it. I'm going to go back into my pile of scraps, and I'm going to grab a piece of black that's going to cover this area and a piece of black that's going to cover that area, plus, of course, seam allowances. So I've got, that's a good size piece. I just need 2 chunks of this. I'm going to come into this side first, and you've probably already figured out what it is I'm going to do. I'm just going to line it up with that raw edge and stitch with 1/4 of an inch. Now, obviously, you're not going to really be able to see if you cut off your star legs, so you might end up with some blunted points, but I did pretty good for sewing blindly, so we'll keep that. And then on this side, I'm going to take that same piece of scrap like I did before. I'm going to line it up with this piece. I'm not going to worry about those. I'm going to stitch with 1/4 of an inch all the way down. You could obviously trim that up, line it up before you put it on here, but you don't have to. And then I'm going to bring it back over here, and I'm going to flip this over. Now, because this is black going against black, I don't have to worry about this fabric showing through, so I could leave that there. Nobody's going to ever know. Or if I wanted to, I could come in and trim this with a couple of snips from my scissors, and this would give me some extra little pieces of scraps that I could use in a future postcard instead of just wasting it and leaving it in there. And we'll flip that over. Now, once all of that is done, I do need to clean it up. And I have this handy dandy template from my friend Ian, the Off Quilter Crafter. This is a collab that he did with Fallon and Matt from So Be It Quilts, and I want to show you how this works. So the neat thing about this is you can actually see the postcard through the template, and you have a couple of markings that you can use to line everything up. You've got your crosshairs, you have your dead center, and you have a 1/4 inch mark all the way around. This does measure 5 inches by 7 inches. I'm not too worried about where the star lands on this. I'm more worried about making sure that my entire postcard measures to the size of my batting, since my batting was pre-cut. And so for that reason, what I'm going to do is grab a rotating mat. I'm going to put the postcard top side down, and I'm just going to use the template to clean up all 4 sides so that it's the size of that batting. And then all of this scrap would help if I cut right through that corner, right? All of this scrap can come off and be used for a future project. And how about that? It is probably a little bit more wonky than we would have wanted in a quilt block, but for a postcard, I think it's great. Now, I will lose these points here and probably there when I zigzag stitch, but if I cover it up with my finger, it still looks pretty cool. And I don't have any distracting quilting stitches on the fabric postcard. This can go through the mail, and those beautiful contrasting colors will shine perfectly for the recipient. And it's justified a little. It's not dead center, so that's okay too. That worked out better than I thought it would. That's a technique I'm going to put into my toolbox, and I will definitely use in the future. But now I want to elevate that quilt as you go game and see if I can use my long arm to make an entire quilt and piece it at the same time. So let's get to that. Okay, so I have an idea that's going to involve the long arm. Right now, I'm loading a 2.5 or 3 yard cut, somewhere around there, of a 108 backing, and I'm making sure to put the selvages on the take-up bar and the front bar so that those are the nice straight pieces. And you might see me walk back and forth with an iron a little bit. There are a couple of pretty bad wrinkles off of the bolt that I was just trying to press out. My thought is, if I have that 108 loaded on my long arm, then why couldn't I grab some batting and a jelly roll and do a jelly roll race of sorts? I'm thinking I can piece those strips together while I'm also stitching through the batting and the backing, hence quilting it as we go. So probably killing two birds with one stone with this quilt. Whew! I just loaded the long arm and I'm sweating buckets. Time to hydrate. Okay, so I already know that I'm going to be laying this fabric onto the batting and the backing on the long arm, and I want to help keep it as straight and flat as possible since I'm going to be piecing this as I quilt it. So what I'm doing is pulling out this entire jelly roll. By the way, somebody else out there is going to ask me what the name of this fabric is. It is called Twilight, and I think it's One Canoe 2 is the name of the designer. It's from Motive Fabrics. I bought this jelly roll years ago. My mom wanted me to turn it into a jelly roll rug. Obviously, that didn't happen. So I figured this would be a great fabric line to test out whether or not I could do this on the long arm. So I'm starching each of these strips with a little bit of best press. And the reason why I'm doing that is because it's going to give it a little bit of body, but it's also going to help remove some of the stretchiness in the fabric. It's going to cause it to shrink up just a teeny bit in between the two selvage ends. And that crease that's right in the middle of the strip is going to be removed too because, I'm ironing it. So I'm pressing all of these strips so that I can move on to the next step, which is cleaning up those selvage ends. So I'm taking every single one of these strips that I starched, I'm folding them in half, and then I'm measuring about 1.5 inches over from that selvage end, and I'm just going to cut that off so that I end up with a bunch of strips that are about the same size. Now, I did do a little bit of math in my head, and I realized that I don't want to use all 42 pieces of this fabric on my quilt because then it would measure 40 inches wide because that's how wide the fabric is, and then about 80 inches long because each of these are 2.5 inch strips. And when you remove the 1/2 inch from the 2 1/4 inch seam allowances, you're going to get 2 inches finished. 40 by 80 seemed like a really oddly shaped quilt. And so what I did instead was I chose 30 of these strips so that I had a quilt that before washing and shrinkage was going to measure around 40 by 60, which I think is a great throw size. And don't worry, those extra strips that we're not using, I set aside and use them as a scrappy binding for this quilt, which you're going to see when I reveal the finished project. So before anybody asks, this next step is definitely sped up. And yes, those are the puppies running around in the background. They were enjoying playing while I was playing on the long arm. So what I did with each of the strips of fabric is I just laid them out like I would if I were piecing them, but I just put them on top of the batting. And then I used the long arm to stitch the pieces of fabric together, just making sure that I was going through the batting and the backing. Now I have electric channel magnetic locks. I'm not even sure if that's the right name for them, but essentially what these are is channel locks that are, they have magnets in them. So when I toggle them one way, it keeps the machine only moving left to right, and another direction keeps the machine only moving front to back. It kind of locks those wheels that would have allowed it to move in the other direction. I found this particularly helpful because it helped me make sure that my machine was always going only left to right and stitching in a straight line. Now, the problem that I have is sometimes those straight lines were not perfectly parallel to the edge of the fabric. And I think that might have been just because of the way the quilt was loaded. I'll tell you, when I was piecing this and quilting it as I went, I thought that that was going to be a bigger deal than it actually ended up being. By the time the whole quilt was finished, you couldn't even tell that some of the areas were less than 2 inches on those strips and others were not. I just made sure to just trust the process and went with the flow. Now, you may have noticed after I attached each new piece of fabric, I kind of went over and appeared to do some just straight line quilting. And that is exactly what I did. Every time a new strip of fabric was added to the quilt, I used the electric channel locks to do a straight line stitching about a 1/4 inch away from each one of those seams, which just added a little bit more of a quilting texture to the quilt and made it feel like it just wasn't fabric that was laying on top of some batting. Of course, because I quilted through the batting and the backing when I was piecing it, this was not needed. It was just there for decorative purposes. Oh my goodness, that worked out so much better than I thought it was going to. I absolutely love this technique, and I will be doing more quilts just like this one. I hope you'll tackle it too. You can do it on your domestic machine or your long arm, and you can always add quilting elements to it as you're going along so that you can have kind of that quilted look. But the beauty of it is you don't need to, because all the layers are secured when you're putting those seams together. Let me know if this is a technique that you're going to tackle. And if you do, make sure to tag me on your pictures on social media. I would love to see your creations. Thank you, friends, for hanging out with me, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!